Welcome back to another video by the Georgia Pinchis. As many of you know, last October we took a trip to Hawaii. What some of you may not know is that we were put on quarantine during this trip. In this video, we're going to discuss how you can avoid being put on quarantine like we were, and if you're unfortunate enough to be put on quarantine, the steps you can take to legally get off quarantine and salvage your Hawaiian vacation. So, you finally arrived in Hawaii. Many months of planning have gone into this trip, and despite your best efforts, you've been placed on 10-day quarantine. You're thinking, my trip is ruined. Now I've got to watch everybody relax and have fun on the beach from my hotel balcony. Well, we're here to tell you, you don't. I'm not going to go into a deep dive on how to apply for the exemption from quarantine. There are literally hundreds of videos going over that. In this video, I'm going to go over how to legally get off the 10-day Hawaiian quarantine once you've been put on it. As you may or may not know, there are really only 3 reasons you can apply for exemption from the 10-day quarantine. The first of these is you've had COVID-19, and you had it no longer than 90 days and no less than 15 days from the date of arrival in Hawaii. The second, you've been fully vaccinated more than 15 days before arrival and have a valid vaccination card. The third, and the most difficult to time correctly, involves getting a negative NAAT or PRC test done. Antigen, AG, and antibody tests are not accepted. This negative test must come from a facility approved by the state of Hawaii. For most of us on the mainland, that means CVS, Walgreens, or Costco. This negative test must have been administered no longer than 72 hours before arrival. And here's where it gets tricky. With the backlog at many of the current testing facilities and laboratories, it can take up to 5 days to get your results back. This is the part where we ran into trouble. Now let me say, we are by no means anti-vaxxers. We have both been vaccinated, but for Teresa, her final vaccination was on October 7th. Our plane landed on October 11th. Thus, her vaccination was not eligible for exemption. See, we have both had corona. We both got it in February of 2021. So being that we already had the antibodies in our system, she wanted to wait 6 or 8 months after the corona had left our system before getting a vaccination, thus prolonging the time that vaccination would be effective. We had no idea that the last dose must be administered 15 days before arrival until we were filling out the questionnaire you must fill out 24 hours before our plane departed. Once we found this out, we were in a panic. We were trying to find a place that we could get an appointment to get tested. We were able to find a CVS about 30 minutes from our home that had an opening on noon the day before our flight. They did, however, tell us that it could be up to 5 days before we got the results. At this time, we were thinking, oh well, if we get the results late, we can just show them the next day and we'll be taken off the quarantine list, right? Wrong. Once you've been placed on the 10-day quarantine in Hawaii, there are only 2 ways to get off. We'll go over those 2 ways in a minute. So she took her test and we prayed for the best. There is about a 6-hour time difference between Atlanta and Hawaii. So our plane didn't land until almost 7 p.m. Hawaii time on Monday, the following day. We figured time was on our side. All the time changes and differences gave us a day and a half until our plane landed. Let me also say this. Hawaii does go by the hours, not the days since the test was administered. And they do account for the time change. So, for example, if you landed at noon on a Monday, flying from the East Coast of the United States, that means your test must have been taken no earlier than 6 a.m. on the Friday before your trip. So, you may be thinking, no problem. But remember this, in some areas, especially areas that are not close to testing or lab facilities, areas like rural areas or places with smaller populations, it can take that full 5 days to get your test results. Needless to say, for us, it did take longer than the 37 hours we had to get the test results, and we were placed on quarantine. We thought our trip was ruined. Tears were shed, and we were both upset. It was a full 60 hours after the test was administered before we got the results. This is where another wrench was thrown in our plans. So, we had done a little studying and found out what we had to do. All we had to do was wait for the negative test to come back. Well, the test came back, and it was a sample invalid. After making a few calls, we found out this happens to about 15% of tests. It can happen if there isn't enough sample on the cotton swab, the sample gets too hot or too cold, or there is too much mucus on the cotton swab. We think that ours got too hot. The metal drop box for the samples was outside and in direct sunlight. Anyway, our plans to get off quarantine were thrown another curveball. We refused to spend the next days locked in our hotel room on a vacation we had planned so long and spent so much on. So we got to work trying to find out what to do. As I told you before, we had formulated a plan for what to do once her negative test came back. Now, not having a negative test, we had another hurdle to overcome. We called CVS. We were connected to the pharmacy at the location where we took the test. Let me say that I think CVS has some of the best customer service we have ever experienced. The lady in the pharmacy there helped us salvage our trip. Now, I'm going to get to the only two ways you can get off quarantine in Hawaii once you've been placed on it. The first way is to complete the 10-day quarantine. Once that is complete, you're off. As we were only in Hawaii for 8 days, this was not an option. So, we had to go with the second option. Leave the island and come back. So here's how we did it. Leaving the island of Oahu doesn't mean you go to another Hawaiian island. It means returning to the mainland. For us, that meant flying to Los Angeles, getting tested, and returning. In order to get taken off the quarantine list, you must email a valid boarding pass for a flight off the island to safetravels@eworlds.com. So that's what we did. The state of Hawaii, upon receiving the email with the valid boarding pass off the island, will check with the airlines and confirm your flight. They will then remove you from the quarantine list at the time the flight lands at its destination. From there, you must get a valid test from an approved location, create another trip on the travel.hawaii.gov website, and reapply for exemption. This is where the help of the lady from CVS became invaluable. We couldn't get an appointment at a CVS in Los Angeles. We called the original testing facility that we used and explained the situation. The lady at the pharmacy helped us get an appointment time at a CVS really close to the airport. Also, this is very important. She found out the testing company used by that CVS and the sample pickup times. This ensured that the sample would arrive at the testing facility on the same day that we took the test. So, if you're going to attempt this approach, make sure you ask questions. Ask questions like which testing company is used and what are the pickup times. You'll want a facility with 2 sample pickup times, at least one of those pickup times at midday, so you can schedule your appointment before the pickup time. Next, make sure that you use Quest as their lab. Quest does testing 24 hours a day. Doing this can ensure you'll get the results back as quickly as possible. And this worked for us. We got the test back the next day before the return flight landed. So we did lose a day and a half of vacation, but salvaged our Hawaii trip that we had planned a year for. One thing to remember, by far the easiest way to ensure you don't get put on the 10-day quarantine is to get vaccinated 15 days prior to your trip. If this isn't an option for you and you don't get your test back by the time you land, you will have to spend the money to fly back to the mainland and get a test, then fly back to Hawaii. This is the only way to legally get off quarantine once you've been placed on it in Hawaii. We did find a few cases of people who were legally taken off quarantine, but they used illegal means to do it. One guy's story involved a shell game of 3 flights, all later canceled, but at the core, he still had to email a boarding pass to the safetravels@eworlds.com and get a negative test less than 72 hours before the flight returning to Hawaii landed. Another involved using emergency medical attention to get a negative test, but they still had to send the email and boarding passes, then file for an exemption on their return flight. I say all that to say this: the only way to be removed from the 10-day quarantine early is to leave Hawaii and email your boarding passes to the safetravels@eworlds.com email. Also, keep in mind that you do have to show your boarding passes to your hotel. This is because once you are placed on quarantine status, they do inform the hotel you are staying in. Another side note is, if you're staying at an Airbnb or with friends or family, you will not be allowed to enter Hawaii, as you cannot quarantine anywhere other than the approved hotel. So, if this all seems like a ginormous headache, that's because it is. The reason we're making this video is because hopefully all the troubles that we went through and all the hard work we had to do to get off quarantine will be helpful to someone. I hope you enjoy your trip to Hawaii. Mahalo, and thanks for watching. We hope you subscribe to our channel, especially if you're planning a trip to Hawaii. We've got plenty of fun trips and the things that we did in Hawaii on our channel. Watch some of the videos and get ideas on what you can do on your Hawaiian vacation. We've only got about 2 more videos left from our trip to Hawaii: Pupukia tide pools and one about our experience in our hotel on quarantine. Also, we've got that video coming up with our found film from the thrift store. So hopefully you subscribe, like, and comment. Also, share our videos if you know somebody who might enjoy them. We thank you for stopping in and hope you subscribe. Have a wonderful day.